Welcome everybody to today's professional development session for the co-requisite math support professional development. This is being led by the co-requisite math task force of the Nevada System of Higher Education. My name is Brandon Protas. I am a strategy director at Complete College America, and we are very excited to present today's session on growth mindset and affective learning. This is going to be presented by Katie Crowther and Andrea Hendricks from Georgia State University, who are experts in this field. To get started, I would like to invite Crystal Abba. She is the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs at the Nevada System of Higher Education, to give a welcome to everybody.
Good afternoon, and more importantly, happy Friday. I don't know about you, but I'm grateful that the week is over. I wanted to be very brief and just starting out by once again thanking Complete College America for their ongoing support of our co-rec activities. We couldn't be where we were at today without them. And of course, as you all know, we are facing full-scale implementation in fall 21, which is just around the corner. I'd also like to take an opportunity to thank Catherine and Andrea for their support today and sharing with us their best practices related to growth mindset and effective learning. I can't think of a better way to spend a Friday afternoon than with your colleagues and working on something as critical as this. So thank you all, and let's get to it. Take care.
Thank you so much. It says a lot, and I've said this before, to have the support that we do from the system office for this important move to full-scale co-requisite support within the state. So just a little bit about Complete College America. You'll see our mission and our vision. While I won't read those to you, I do want to point out the parts that I've highlighted. We have a singular focus, and that is on increasing college completion rates and closing institutional performance gaps. We see those as one and the same because you can't do one without the other. And we use the term institutional performance gaps. That's based off of the work of Estela Ben-Simon at the Center for Urban Education. That's because it puts the responsibility and the accountability on institutions, our policymakers. We know that when we make changes, we can have a dramatic impact on student success and academic outcomes. If we can move to the next slide. Complete College America is known for a variety of strategies, and these are divided into 4 pillars of purpose, momentum, structure, and support. Well, there's 18 different strategies. They work well together. I do want to point out that co-requisite support is one of our game changer strategies for which we advocate at Complete College America. It's one we've been talking about for about a decade, a little bit more than a decade. And in fact, we have a new report out called No Room for Doubt, Moving Co-Requisite Support from Idea to Imperative. You'll be able to, hopefully you've received a copy. If not, I'll tell you in just a second how you're able to do this. But we know, and this goes to the role of institutions, when we make these changes around co-requisite support, we've seen doubling, tripling, actually in some cases quadrupling and quintupling of pass rates of that college level math course within the first year. So we salute the work that you're doing in the state of Nevada. I know you're in front of a computer because we're doing this remotely. So if you can go to completecollege.org, and you'll see that in the chat as well. You'll be able to sign up, and by logging in and creating a profile, you have access to a lot of the Complete College America resources, including that report that I just mentioned, No Room for Doubt. It is our latest report. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, so it is hot off the presses. You see the link there as well. And this is going to be really important for the work that you're doing statewide and specifically within your institutions. I will put into the chat, and what you see on the screen here is the professional development series for math. We have our final session next week, and I'm putting these all here, even the past ones, because either for you or your colleagues, these have been recorded so that you have access to these as we prepare for the statewide implementation. These are available on the NSHE website, which you will see linked to in the chat. So please be sure to check out past webinars as well as the one that we have next week. I will also in a second put a link to the chat to the evaluation because we do appreciate your feedback. I'll put there now just so I can have it up on your screen at the end. of the session if you wouldn't mind just taking a few minutes to complete an evaluation. And with that, it is my distinct honor to be able to introduce Katie Crowther and Andrea Hendricks, again from Georgia State University, who's really been leading the field when it comes to growth mindset and affective learning. So I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Brandon. It's very nice to be here. We are so happy to have been invited. I wish that I could actually be in Nevada because I've never been, and that would be a wonderful place to travel to have a little adventure. But we are delighted to bring this to you from Atlanta, our presentation on growth mindset and affective learning. I'm Katie Crowther, and I'm going to be presenting today with Andrea Hendricks. And we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves, and then we will get started here. See. So I am actually not a math professor. I'm an associate professor of English, but I'm also a faculty associate in the Center for Teaching and Learning and Online Education. So I do a lot of these kind of workshops. We are both at Perimeter College, which is a two-year college, which is a part of Georgia State's university. We were a standalone community college for many years until we merged with Georgia State. So we do have more of an access mission, and so that changes the demographic of students that we serve. And so I was going to pass it over to Andrea to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea Hendricks. I have been at the college for 28 of my 29 years teaching in higher education, and I teach math, specifically the co-requisite for college algebra is what I primarily do. I only teach one class a year right now since I'm associate department chair of the online math and computer science department. But I was on that initial team that created the co-requisite course for college algebra, and we've been teaching those courses since 2015. And in 2018, we completely eliminated the foundations courses and went solely the co-rec model. So all of our students that are weak and needing support start at those levels. So it's very nice to be with you today, and I'll turn it back over to you, Katie.
So we thought it might be nice to start with a little check-in to see how you're feeling, partially because it's a great way to start any class or session, a little temperature check. And it is Friday, and we're probably all a little tired and at the end of the day. And also because we're going to be talking about feelings and emotions and how they affect the way we learn, and how going into a learning experience with a particular feeling or emotion about that learning experience can impact the way we learn. So if you could just take a second to put a little emoji in the chat on how you're feeling right now. And if you use the Windows logo key, that little Windows thing plus a period, you'll get an emoji menu. And the same for if you're on a Mac, you can use a Control Command space bar to get a cool little emoji menu. And that helps speed up the process of putting an emoji in the chat. So let us know how you're feeling. And you can be honest. Some smiles, some bigger smiles and some smaller smiles. Haven't got a tired emoji yet. Verbal works just fine, Mike. Oh, it was supposed to be tired. Okay, Daniel. Okay, interesting. Oh, well, everyone looks pretty positive and excited to be here. So that's good news. You're all probably just too nice to put a sort of, oh, it's Friday, I'm in a meeting kind of emoji, if that one exists. But I'm glad to see everybody is here excited to learn, because that's, as we're going to learn, is going to make a difference. So today's run-up show, what are we going to do? We're going to give you some background in affective learning and growth mindset. I'm going to focus on the background material, some of the theory, and then Andrea, who's our math expert, is going to give you some really hands-on material and strategies that you can use in the classroom. What you need to do is try to stay engaged. We are going to do a couple of activities that you can do. One you could do on your phone or in a browser. The other, you'll have to use a browser. So make sure you have that ready. You have questions, post them in the chat. It's hard for me to see them because I'm sharing my screen, but Andrea will keep an eye. And if we need to take a pause to answer a question, that's fine. And if you wouldn't mind keeping your mics muted, and we will have a pause halfway through to answer some questions when you can unmute your mics. Okay, so barring any questions, we'll move into today's learning outcomes. We want to, by the end of today's session, for all of you to be familiar with the theoretical underpinnings of affective learning and growth mindset, to understand how these principles can be used in the co-requisite math classroom to enhance student success. And we want you all to generate your own ideas for using these principles and develop a sort of toolbox of ideas for teaching strategies, assignments, and assessments that promote a growth mindset, metacognition, and self-regulated learning. And those are all things we will touch on today. So before we get started, I'd like you just to take a couple of minutes, maybe just a minute, to reflect on the following questions. So you can jot down a couple of notes if you want to, or just think about it. What do you already know about growth mindset? And what does affective learning mean to you? What questions maybe have you already thought about? What are your personal goals for this session? And what is one thing you have challenged yourself with lately? Just take a couple of minutes to reflect. You don't have to share these.
Did you have a good week?
Yes.
You did?
Yeah. My dogs.
Okay, I'm going to move on, although you may not have answered all of them, and that's fine. But there is a reason that I have asked you to start by thinking about what you already know about growth mindset and affective learning. And that is to activate your prior learning, which is actually a small teaching strategy, which is another pedagogical approach that we're not going to talk about today, but it's one of my favorites. And it's a way of just embedding small activities at the beginning, in the middle, and the end of classes that engage deeper learning. And one of those is to activate prior learning, to get students thinking about what they already know. And you're creating a bridge between prior knowledge and new learning. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention this is because this strategy of reflecting on what you already know gets attention. It gains the attention of the students. And attention is something we're going to talk about today as it falls into the affective learning domain. It helps people think about the topic and make connections. And it also begins to motivate learners and to link to goals and to real life. And motivation is going to be another factor in the discussion today about growth mindset. And the last question I asked you about having overcome something this week is to start you off in a positive mindset, because as you, I'm sure, already know, that's going to be vital for a growth mindset. So I wanted to think about your growth mindset as you come in to today's session ready to learn. So let's see if we can make our technology work here. What I want to do is to get you thinking, because we're going to be talking about emotions and feelings in the affective domain. And that might not be something we're used to talking about when it comes to learning or teaching math. But I'm sure you agree that there are a lot of feelings associated with being in a first-year math class. So I'd like you to either use your browser to go to the link on the screen, polev.com. /Catherine Croat 004, or you can use your phone to text the number 37607, and then you type in the phrase Catherine Croat 004, and it will let you know that you have joined the session. Once you've done that, please answer the question with a word. What emotions and attitudes do you commonly see in first-year math students? And if you have trouble with the technology, it's also fine to put it in the chat. but I'm hoping we'll get to see. Now I'm going to go to the next slide while you're doing that, but you will still be able to see the information on how to join if you haven't yet joined. That's okay. You'll still see it on the next slide. And what we should see is as you put in your responses, they will pop up on the screen. What emotions and attitudes do you commonly see in first-year math students? Trepidation. As an English professor, I'm very excited about that word. That's a good one. Lack of confidence. Yes. Ooh, look at that. Rarely overconfidence, right? Fear, dread, sometimes hopelessness. Oh, somebody else must have put in hopelessness because it got really big. It's making an interesting shape. Fear, dread, trepidation. Math is hard. Entitlement. Boredom, inutility. Yeah, a lot of negative emotions we're seeing. Do we see students who are excited to learn? Do we see students who are enthusiastic? Seems not, especially if we're talking about co-requisite math. Math is hard, yes. Andrea, do you want to unmute and comment here on what you see, or if there's anything in the chat, let me know.
Math anxiety is also written in the chat.
Okay.
Yes, but I can definitely concur that these are feelings that I deal with every semester from students who are coming into co-requisite courses and feel very overwhelmed with learning the prerequisite material along with the gateway course material. So we spend a lot of time, I do spend a lot of time trying to get students to the point where they're ready and capable of learning and accepting that they can go further and do more, and we'll talk some strategies later on.
Great, thank you for participating. I'm very excited that the technology worked as well. Poll Everywhere is a neat tool that you can use, again, to get students participating. So let's jump into what we're talking about. Why am I asking you about the students' emotions, and what can we do about it, really, is the question. Because we might think, well, of course my students are going to come into class like that. You know, that's not my fault. And you know, they just need to fix their attitude, right? So how can we think about this in terms of learning and concrete strategies? So affective learning is actually part of Bloom's taxonomy of learning, and I'm going to get into that in a second, but here are a few definitions. This can be learning that relates to learner's interests, attitude, motivations, the attitude of the student towards learning and the educational experience. Learning that is characterized by factors such as motivation, emotions, and other psychological aspects of learning, and personal awareness in learning. And we can see how that will tie into the metacognitive part, and connection to a personal value system. And those words that I've highlighted there are the words that are going to become pretty important as we talk about those things and how they play into the way we learn. So as I mentioned, we all are familiar, I'm sure, with Bloom's taxonomy of learning. And what we always focus on is the cognitive stages of learning, because we are trying to target those different stages and make sure that the way that we are teaching and the way that we are using assignments and assessments is targeting the different zones of learning. And you can see the traditional pyramid on the left with knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And then a more modern version of the pyramid, which changes those words into those nice active verbs so that we can think about how we might write learning outcomes that target those cognitive areas of learning. But Bloom didn't just talk about cognitive domain. He also added later on in some later research, the psychomotor domain, the doing, and the affective domain, the feeling. And you can see in the little model that affective domain includes all kinds of things related to feelings and emotions, enthusiasm, values, which is very important, attitudes, etc. So we will tap into those as we continue to talk today about specific strategies we can use. So if we're talking about affective learning, what does that look like? What are the subdomains? And this is not quite as intuitive as the cognitive domains. So I'm just going to walk you through it fairly quickly so we can get into the nitty-gritty of the toolbox, the hardcore strategies you can use. So the affective domain is described as having receiving, then responding, valuing, organizing, and then characterizing by a value. And those are measured in degrees of internalization. And what does that mean? If we look at, we sort of break down each category, we see that receiving is simply passively paying attention, just being aware, being in the room really. Responding, actively participating in the learning process. So we can think about when we have conversations or discussions or presentations. Valuing, and again, this is where we start to get into that, well, how does this relate to what I can impact? Valuing is ability to see the worth of something. And this can lead to the idea that if something is worth putting the work in, then the student will take the responsibility for putting that effort in. Organizing, putting together those values and then relating them to your already held values and your belief system. This connects to balancing priorities and deciding what to prioritize. And that can come into thinking about work-life balance and the way that the student manages their studies. And then the last one is characterizing. So acting consistently in accordance with the values you've internalized. So letting those values guide your behavior. So having students who know how to think about their learning responsibly and how to turn that into effective learning. So if we look again at the cognitive domain, because this might be hard to sort of think about, well, how does this relate again to learning? How does affect relate to learning? So if we go back to the cognitive domain, and this is kind of a different version here where we see it broken down into recall, explaining in own words, performing tasks, deconstructing elements, critique based on experience, and add to existing knowledge. If we then look at the affective learning domain, we can do that same thing. We can break it down into what does that look like. So the receiving would be present and listening, responding, actively participates, valuing, believes strongly, organizing values into their personal value system, and characterizing value system influences others. And I know I'm going fairly fast over this, but I just want to make sure you have a sense of where this is coming from. You can obviously go back later and look at these slides again. But I think it helps us see, and I think the next slide especially helps us see how the cognitive and affective domains are connected and how we need to be addressing the affective domain in order to be accessing the cognitive domain. To prime students for learning, we have to think about how the affect domain is actually part of that learning. So if we want students to be able to explain in their own words, which is the cognitive on the left, we want them to be present and listening. We want them to perform a task. We need to think about how to get them to actively participate. And then to organize their learning by their value system as well. And that's going to make that part of their permanent value system in terms of how they learn. So if we map those two together, we see that we have to look at the affective domain in order to get to the cognitive domain. So this quote here, I like because it brings all of these elements together. It shows us how those three domains work together. So consider for a moment the independent contributions of the domains of learning in the following example: delivering a motivational speech. It is the interaction of cognitive learning outcomes, so the knowledge of organizational strategies within a speech or application of strategies for persuading others. Then the affective learning outcomes, valuing the activity, demonstrating its value through perseverance with the task of speech writing and delivery, and psychomotor learning outcomes, so modulation of voice, use of nonverbal gestures, that determine the overall effectiveness of the speech. So we can see how all of those things come together, but that affective part had to precede, in many ways, the cognitive part in order to make that task successful. So why does affective learning matter? That's basically what I'm getting at here, because it impacts the fundamental underpinnings of learning. It gets at motivation, interest, engagement, and attention. And if we don't have those, then we are not going to be able to get to that learning. There's a great quote here that I pulled out of some research. New neuroscience findings confirm that affect is complexly intertwined with thinking and performing important functions that may guide rational behavior, assist memory retrieval, support decision-making, and enhance creativity. In fact, studies demonstrated that emotional skills can be more influential than cognitive abilities in personal and career success. So we're showing here how these things are so intertwined that we can't just ignore our students when they come into the classroom with these big emotions. We have to address it as part of the learning. And this especially goes to students who are coming in perhaps from a background of not having a deep understanding of math, maybe for first generation college students and underprivileged college students. And this quote addresses that. Most of us have had students ask, why do I need to learn this? When will I ever use this? Or the dreaded, will this be on the test? While some students intrinsically enjoy learning about new topics for the sake of learning, this isn't true of all our students. For example, first generation college students often report being motivated to go to college to help their families. They want to know how the information will be useful to them. The affective domain answers the questions about why we are learning what we are learning. And in the classroom, this can look like lots of different things that we are used to seeing. We are seeing how students are participating and responding. Some of it we're not seeing, how they're valuing it, whether they feel like they are worth being in that classroom. It taps into belongingness. Many of our students come into the classroom and feel like they are not supposed to be there, or maybe after that first test and when they don't do well, they feel like, well, that's been confirmed, I don't belong in college. And belongingness is something that Andrea will talk about later. And organizing and synthesizing, which taps into study skills and the ability to regulate your own learning. So many of the ways the affective domain plays out in the classroom are things that we are familiar with from when we teach, but we may not be attributing them as such. So I've been doing a lot of talking, and I want to get us to an activity here. And we're going to go into a break room in about a minute or two. And in the break room, what I would like you to do is think about how can we write learning outcomes that directly address the affective domain. So, and I know we haven't got to the nitty-gritty yet about growth mindset and self-regulated learning, but I want us to think about how, just even off the bat, when we start a course, we could be thinking about these domains of learning in our learning outcomes. So these are some keywords that we can use to think about these different domains. So if we're thinking about the receiving, we can think about words like listens and understands and acknowledges. If we're talking about responding, which might also tap into motivation, we might think in our learning outcomes about discusses, greets, performs, presents. And so on. I'm not going to read the whole chart to you, but these words will help us think in terms of learning outcomes because they are active. And there's a second page to this. And what I have done is I've made a handout, and I'm going to drop that link in the chat so you can have the handout in front of you. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and what I would like you to do in your small groups is, using the worksheet and what we've talked about right up till this point, is to write one or two learning outcomes that you could use in the first year co-requisite classroom to address the affective domain, and using that worksheet to help you with some of those active verbs. So what we'll do is we'll have you go into the break rooms, which I think that Brandon is probably creating right now.
Yep. I have them set up, and just so people know, we will pause the recording so people feel candid in their conversations, and people will be in groups of 4 or 5. Perfect. So just brainstorm for about 3 to 5 minutes on what you've learned and how you think you see the ways you can address the affective domain. Draft a few, and then when we come back, will have maybe one reporter per group share in the chat. I've allocated about 8 minutes for this. I think if you get done early, you can just come back into the main room. Is that right, Brad? Yes, that's correct. Okay, so if we see everybody back here, we'll know that we're all done. So let me go ahead and breakout sessions. And if you want to take it away, Katie. All right, welcome back. It always feels like you've been sort of teleported. So I hope you guys had some good conversation. Why don't
you write what you in the chat, just a little bit about maybe your learning outcomes that you drafted, and you can also maybe unmute your mic if you want to tell us a little bit about what you discussed. So go ahead and have at least one person per group type the learning outcomes in the chat.
Katie?
Yeah.
I wanted to share what we talked about, because our group we weren't able to come up with outcomes very easily. We looked over the examples. We did talk about, that's kind of why we're here, is to learn to do this part. But something that we had a conversation about for a bit while looking over the examples is with the exception of one of the examples, we don't even understand how we would go about constructing or assessing these outcomes. Like what measure do you use? Like, okay, participates in class, that's easy enough. You can measure that with some check marks. But then the second example on the paper here is sensitive towards individual and cultural difference and values diversity. Right. Do we give a quiz for that? Like, how do you test that in a non-abrasive, actual finding it out type way?
Right, and so some of these are going to come into things like dynamics in like group projects and collaboration and things like that. But that one, that might be less relevant for the math classroom. These are obviously going to be how we can adapt them to make it work. And I think you're right; it will make a little bit more sense when we get into some of the more concretes. But what I really was sort of hoping you would look at were those kind of verbs like participates, and thinking about how we get to bring, like, for example, the idea of how students value the learning that they're doing. Why is it important, and why should they care about it? Those are the kind of thing that can come into those value domains. But yeah, I see in the chat now somebody said we spoke about throwing out words to get people to discuss and participate. Okay, I think I'm missing one in the chat here. I can't see my chat very well. Andrea, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, Anne said our group had a similar response to Daniel's group. And then Joanne mentioned about the words for people to discuss and participate. And Eric said we had a rich discussion and had some examples that we characterized as within the affective domain, but had difficulty crafting any objectives. So I'm not sure if Eric, do you want to share anything from your discussion?
Well, I'm not sure that I can be any more specific. It seemed like all of us in the group that I was in are pretty new to this and are enthusiastic about it. But with a brief introduction and this description of the different levels of the affective hierarchy, I guess you could call it, we just weren't quite maybe up to speed yet to where we could actually get down to crafting objectives. The one that was just mentioned, the student will participate, that's a really straightforward one. And I guess we sort of skipped over that. It makes a lot of sense, but we just didn't think of that particular one.
Yeah, and I guess like,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And I guess the concern we were expressing was like, when we craft a student learning outcome, we're crafting something that we have to be able to measure, that we have to be able to assess. An effective student learning outcome is measurable, just like a goal.
Right.
And the examples we're seeing here and the stuff we're trying to measure, how do we get a concrete measure of some of these things that we can report to whatever accreditation body we have, or just to our department to see how we're doing? And it's like very, very difficult to craft it in such a way that it would be measurable.
Absolutely. And we will get to some of that. So why don't we just do this? Why don't we say, let's bracket it and think about moving into the strategies that Andrea is going to talk about, and we'll see if we can loop back to this at the end and use this at the end to help us think about objectives. Okay.
And one more comment though, Katie, Joanne mentioned also students explain what they might explain to another student about what they may have discussed the day before. But I will just say, Daniel, I've been teaching in the prerequisite courses for, I guess, 5-6 years now. My college actually does not have explicit learning objectives for this affective domain, but there are activities that we implement in the course, and really we kind of get at it through a lot of surveys and just interaction with students on that level, but it's not something that we per se say we measure this learning outcome specifically, but we give a lot of attention to it. So hopefully there'll be more clarity around that later on.
Right, and that's pretty much at the level I'm at in my pilot right now. We address this stuff, we talk about this stuff, we do things to encourage this stuff, but we don't have it as a learning outcome because how do we measure it?
Yep.
Okay, can you see this next slide? My presentation just
Yes,
stopped
we can.
working for me. Okay, all right. So what we're going to do now is going to start thinking about how we can use this in the classroom and how we can create a learning environment that promotes these types of affective learning strategies that will help our students get to the cognitive learning strategies we're trying to get. And so what the research shows is all the things probably that you already know, is that our students are going to learn best in an open, in an environment of safety, openness, with trust, trust of the instructor, trust that they can fail in the sense of try and keep trying and learn. And the teacher is going to use a learner-centered approach. And so this participatory interactive style of teaching is going to be what's most effective in the affective domain. So how does this connect to some of the strategies we're going to talk about? So affective learning connects in the way that we think about motivation and enthusiasm. That connects to growth mindset and also to grit, which is something you've probably heard about before. We're going to mention in our presentation today, sort of perseverance, academic resilience. So attitudes and values, how do they connect? Well, they connect to metacognition, how we think about learning and how we regulate our own learning. And then those feelings and emotions and values also connect to a sense of belonging in the classroom. And when we have learning moments, how we use those for reflection to make that learning more permanent. And so the good thing about growth mindset, metacognition, and grit, which are all strategies that tap into the affective domain, is that they can all be taught. And they all indicate a relationship with academic success. So metacognition and growth mindset specifically bring students, support students with reaching their goals, and that taps into grit. So those are the things we're going to talk about next. So we're going to do one more interactive activity here to get thinking about growth mindset. And I know some of you have done a little bit with growth mindset before. So what we're going to do, we're going to use Poll Everywhere again. And this time you have to go to the browser. You can't use your phone for this one because I'm asking you, what are the characteristics and behaviors of successful students in first-year math? And when you post your answer, you can then also upvote or downvote other answers. So if you see one that you think, oh yeah, I should have said that, that's a really great answer, you can go ahead and upvote it. And if you see one you think, I don't think that's, but I don't see that, you can downvote it. And then that way, what we'll see on the screen is kind of almost a sense of the priorities or the sense of what is most common in what you see for successful students in first-year math. And I'm going to go to the next screen, but you can, you will still be able to see the information. So we're thinking about characteristics and behaviors of successful students in first-year math. What do they do? And you can use words or short phrases. Oh, willing to risk failure, yes. Andrea, do you want to comment on what you're seeing?
Honestly, this would be exactly my same list as well. Yeah, and I think it's a challenge to get our at-risk first-year math students to actually be willing to take risk and learn from mistakes, because they think making a mistake is bad and that just means that they're not good at math. And so we really do have to overcome those obstacles to help them move forward in their studies. So And these are things I address in my own class. So great list.
Perseverance is rising up. Seek help when they need it. Good time management, and that's going to fall into self-regulated learning as well. I love that willing to risk failure is at the top. What am I not seeing at the bottom? Oh, go to office hours. Yeah. Determined, perseverance, ask questions. These are great.
Yeah, for students not to know how to be resourceful, right? I think that's, I get the at-risk students don't understand that task and how it relates to their studies.
Okay, well, this is great because it really does show us how these types of behaviors connect to the ability to learn, the ability to stick with learning when it's hard, to be willing to risk failure. Oh, fancy annotations happening on the screen. I don't know how that's happening. That's not me. Okay, so that brings us to the idea that effort, that motivation, that knowledge of good study strategies are all part of how our students learn and how we can help them be better learners. And so growth mindset, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, it was a pedagogical theory, but also a more like a social science theory that Carol Dweck came up with. She was writing in 2006 in her book on growth mindset. Fixed mindset students believe their basic abilities, their intelligence, their talents are just fixed traits. They have a certain amount and that's that. And then their goal becomes to look smart all the time and never look dumb. In a growth mindset, students understand that their talents and abilities can be developed through effort, good teaching, and persistence. They don't necessarily think everyone's the same or anyone could be Einstein, but they believe anyone can get smarter if they work at it. So the basics behind growth mindset is the idea that we believe that we can learn new things, and we believe that our brains can grow and change, and that it's not that we are born with ability that is fixed, but rather that we can, if we put enough effort, we can learn something new. So the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset plays out things like the idea of effort is what leads to success, rather than if you're smart, you don't need to try. And this is where one of the conundrums of success comes into play, which is that if you have been good at something in the past and then something feels hard, you tend to think, well, that means I'm not good at it. And if I was going to be good at it, I wouldn't have to try so hard. That effort is actually related to not being good at something. And I think oftentimes our students struggle with that. And the idea that if you have been successful in the past and then you try hard at something and fail, then you'd rather not try anything hard again because you don't want to show that you failed. The idea of neuroplasticity, that our brains can grow and change, versus the idea that you're naturally good or bad at things, and the idea that when it's hard, you're learning, is a growth mindset idea versus I'm no good at this, I can't learn this. And Dweck says what students believe about their brains, whether they see their intelligence as something that's fixed or something that can grow and change, has profound effects on their motivation, learning, and school achievement. So what can you do? So here's one thing that I do, and we're going to talk more specifically about math strategies. Andrea is going to take over in a second. One thing that I do is I create a small module that I put in our LMS at the beginning of the semester, but you could also do many of these strategies in class. And it only takes the students about 15 minutes, so it's a small investment of time, but it just introduces them to the idea of ability versus effort and growth mindset and neuroplasticity. And basically I have a little video where I introduce myself and give them a bit of a pep talk on learning and growth mindset. And I talk a little bit about things that I've done that have been hard. I was a terrible, terrible athlete as a child. I was the one who was picked last in all sports. And then in my 30s, I discovered running, and I've become a runner, and I run marathons. And it's absolutely, to me, still amazing that I do that, because I was convinced it was something I was not good at. So I talk a little bit about overcoming my own struggles. I have them take a mindset quiz on things that they think they're good at or not. And then they move to an engagement activity where they share their responses, and they describe a time when they succeeded at something that was challenging and think about what strategies they used to kind of push through it. And then I have them watch a couple of videos. One of my favorites is one I'm going to talk about in a second, with the picture with Arnold Schwarzenegger there, about neuroplasticity and how their brains grow. And there's a few more items I haven't included here, but I just have the students work through this. They get, you know, a completion grade, a small low stakes grade, and it usually then informs their learning for the rest of the semester. So 2 of the videos I use, and I'm not going to play them, and I hope my computer doesn't try to play them. It's trying to play them. 2 of the videos I use are, one is on mindset, it's a very basic overview, and then the other one is on neuroplasticity. It has that picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it talks about, for example, that when you're lifting weights, you expect it to be hard, and you know that the hard is where you're building muscle. And students often really relate to that example, because the idea that it is when they find something hard like math, that is when the learning is happening, rather than giving up. You know that when you lift weights, you have to have a little pain to have some gain, and that's where the growth is happening. So those are some of the strategies I use. I'm now going to turn it over to Andrea to talk a little bit about the strategies she uses in the math classroom.
Thank you, Katie. So let me tell you, I was not a trained expert in this area. I have been teaching online teaching for 29 years. I've been teaching online for 20 years. And as I started teaching online, I realized that without the instructor present and learning math, obviously was even more difficult right than in a face-to-face classroom. And prior to that, I certainly had opportunities to interact with students and know like firsthand what they were struggling with. But it was really not until I started teaching online did I start researching things that I could do to support my own students in kind of overcoming those barriers that they had towards learning math, right? They felt like they were always bad at math. They would always be bad at math, and they couldn't change that. And so some of these things that I do in the classroom, I do for like participation grades, or I call them reading assignments, and they interact. But it's a small percentage of their grade, but it really does surface some of those things in their brain that they've been kind of pushed down maybe, but when they actually take the class, there's a barrier. And so one of the first ones that I have them do is a belief survey. I call it like their math self-image, right? What message have you told yourself about your math ability prior to this class? And I've had students say, you know, but they were in high school and they failed a geometry class, and so they just always assumed that they were bad at math, right? They stopped taking math in high school, now they're returning to college later on, and they just told themselves that they're bad. And then, do you believe that you can change your math self-image? What do you want your new message to be? And then trying to get them to internalize the fact that math is not the thing that defines them, and their lack of what they think is their inability to learn math is not their identity. And so starting them to think about, well, what do I do beyond math? Just like Katie said about running, like what are things in your own life where you think you do well, or other people in your life say that you do well? And then pointing them to the fact that that didn't happen overnight, right? There were some things that they had to do to get good at that. And so they're just kind of bringing that back to, so how can you apply those traits from that area of your life to this math class? And how will passing this class help you reach your goals? And then what will that feel like once you actually achieve that sense of accomplishment at the end? So it's really, when we think about that affective domain and the hierarchy there, it's really at this point, it's just receiving, getting them to be open to the idea that they can learn, and feeling that what they are going to receive in this class will actually help them advance their goals. And you probably met with students that say, I want to do this in my life, right? And I have to take this math class to be able to do that. And then they're still argumentative about, right, why do I have to take this math class just to be able to do this? So this is like starting to build a bridge so that they can get from their current state to where they want to be. And then really just taking this a step further. Oh, Katie, I'm sorry. You have the control. If we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so getting them to think about, you know, where they are currently with their own mindset, and then now really digging into creating some goals. And I forgot to tell you, I do have a handout, and I'll put it in the URL. It's tinyurl.com/CCA handouts. It's where you can find a little bit more fuller version of these activities that I'm just briefly showing on the screen. I attended a motivational webinar online, and this was revolutionary to me. The speaker was talking about thinking about your goal, but not thinking about looking forward to your goal, thinking about what happens when you've accomplished your goal, when you've reached your goal, then looking backwards to figure out what did you have to do to get there. And that revolutionized the way that I speak with my students now about goal setting, because sometimes when they're at just this beginning level, especially having to take co-requisite math classes, they have many years ahead of them in their studies, like, and this is what they want to be when they grow up, right? Like they can't see where they want to go because of all the things that are in front of them. And so now just helping them to transition and make that vision different, like, okay, now visualize yourself here. What did you have to do to get there? And then really break that down to like weekly goals and the goals in the classroom. And one of the documents in those handouts has a little bit more detail about how to do that, making them SMART goals and things like that. So really that's now kind of advancing us in this hierarchy, because now we're trying to get them to respond by changing their behavior in the course so that we can see that it is tied to their goal and that what they're doing now will advance them to that goal. And math teachers out there, you will appreciate this. There's a book by Darren Hardy, The Compound Effect. And I think students, we're such in this world of we want to see results immediately, right? This immediate gratification. And just reminding them that success is built in daily smart choices, right? The moment-to-moment decisions that they can't really see a visible difference, but the accumulated compounding effect is profound. So really just reminding students that what they're doing now, even though they can't like touch what it is, right, and see that success overnight, it is building to that. So a lot of what I do in my own class is really just that motivational piece, right? Getting students outside in themselves and seeing that they can do this. I really do have that philosophy that any student can learn math. We just have to set themselves up for them to believe it internally. Yeah, and kind of taking it on to like now organizing and integrating specific things in their lives. So now we've set these kind of goals in our course, but what can we do specifically at the beginning of our class, at the midpoint, at the end, to ensure that we're on track to meet those goals? Thinking about what do I want to get, right? What is the grade that I want in this class? What can I do to ensure I get that? So this is really has to impact their decisions right before they can actually achieve those goals. I plan to spend how many hours per week outside of class for this course, right? A lot of students think just come to class and don't do anything else. So right there, we're telling them there's some other things that we expect from them. And then, so they make those goals, and then in the midpoint, so I don't give this survey to them all at the beginning. At the middle of the semester, we'll go back and reevaluate this, right? And say, my grade is currently this. Am I on track? Can I still reach my goal? What changes do I need to make to stay on track? And then at the end of the semester, for them to reflect back on that, right? For them to see that I actually did this and it actually led to some success. So I can carry these skills on with me to the next class that I have to take. So really that's going to that highest level of the affective domain where they're acting and changing their behavior. Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that I didn't really start out, I was thinking I'm a math teacher. I'm not someone that has to come in and teach these other skills, right? I don't even know how to teach those skills. But what I really learned is that teaching these skills is so important for students to be able to learn, especially those at-risk students. So a lot of times instructors think, well, I don't have time to teach this, right? But this is so important that you really need to make time because it really will pay off later on. And having the time in the co-requisite course is obviously prime time that you can use to bring some of these issues in. I think a lot of times we as math teachers think, well, we're trying to prepare our students to be engineers or, whatever it is that they need to go on to. And so we've been math has been known as this weed out course, but we're at a point in our really college stage, college life, really across the United States, that the enrollment from high school students is decreasing, right? Or it's flatlining, but it will start to decrease. I read a report that said by 2026, it's going to decrease. So we really don't have time to be those weed out courses. We need to make sure that we're seed planters and that we're giving our students the ability to grow and flourish, not only in our course, but in other courses. And so it really is kind of the mindset that I'm not just teaching the content, I'm having to teach students about how to be successful in this class, which will pay off in other classes as well. And part of that is just being a place where students have that safety and trust and feeling of belongingness in the course, and that we are including students from all backgrounds and helping them be successful regardless of their history in math and their age and race or any of those things. And really just giving students that time and space to change their focus and attention on what they're learning. And for the faculty, we also have to be priming them for learning. And that kind of goes in with the bridge. And like when they come into the classroom, their minds are on so many different things. But really some of these activities kind of pull them in and center them and give them hope for what's going to happen. And so we're going to pause. Katie, you may want to take over here.
Yeah, so we thought at this point, because we will have been on, or we've been on for a little bit over an hour, that we could take a quick pause for reflection. We've covered or begun talking about growth mindset. We're going to talk a little bit more about it and move into grit and self-regulated learning. But if at this point you have some questions or comments that you want to put in the chat or unmute, we could have a few minutes for that. Or we can keep moving if you'd also rather do that. That's also fine. I'm not seeing anything. So maybe that's a vote for keep moving. Well, actually, what I do have on the next slide is a quick stretch break. So if you want to take like a minute, so we don't run out of time, just to grab a drink of water or stretch, or maybe think about a question or a comment you might have. So just take a minute, just to stretch. Reset your brain. It's probably not enough time to go get coffee. And if you are sticking around and not taking a stretch break, you can also still put a comment or a question in the chat if you have one. Okay, we'll keep going. Hopefully everyone had a chance for a quick yoga move. Is that what that emoji is, maybe? All right, so what we'll do now is talk a little bit how growth mindset connects to two other concepts and pedagogical strategies that have become quite popular when we're talking about affective learning, is the idea of grit and self-regulated learning, which we'll get to in a minute. So grit or academic resilience has it's been around for a little while now. Duckworth, Angela Duckworth wrote her book about it in 2007. And it's defined as the pursuit of long-term goals with sustained passion and effort, basically sticking with learning. And you can see the acronym on the side there: growth, resilience, integrity, tenacity. Duckworth actually developed a 12-item grit scale. They condensed it into an 8-item grit scale. It's a fun little scale. You can have your students take a little quiz and determine their grit. But it separates the grit into 2 related dimensions, which is consistency of interest and perseverance of effort. And I do want to take a moment to say that the idea of grit is a little controversial, especially when we think about our populations that are dealing with grit in their day-to-day lives, and the idea that just come on, just try a little harder, buck up and just push through, when some of our students might be dealing with situations outside of the classroom that are equally deserving of grit, and that they are having to prioritize other things. So we want to be careful how we think about that, and the idea that anybody can just try harder and put more effort in. But we do want to think about how we can teach our students to stick with hard things and to also deal with failure, which was the thing that came up on our little poll earlier. And the grit, the idea that grit sort of underpins the way that we help students learn and learn how to learn. There have been a lot of studies that show the importance of motivation and perseverance as essential characteristics of successful achievers, regardless of their domain or intelligence. And that grit includes behaviors such as working tirelessly to surpass challenges, maintaining prolonged interest, passion, and effort while overcoming adversity and failures. And so notice those words there, like interest and passion. Again, we see how that connects back to that affective domain, that we are trying to channel the students' interest. We need to have that buy-in in order to help them develop those gritty strategies. And that research actually shows that self-regulatory strategies, which we'll talk about in a second, are key to enhancing grit. So how can we build grit in the math classroom? So I'm going to talk about a few general things, and then Andrea will talk about some specifics for math. So we want to build in lots of opportunities to practice and fail. So, and I'm sure as many of you already know this, is to not just wait and give one big midterm, but rather have lots of low stakes exercises, unlimited tries on quizzes, especially if you're doing them online, so you can have them keep doing it and not move to the next module until they maybe get the required number correct. Grade on participation for trying. And then scaffold assignments, so they directly build on a previous skill set, so students can see themselves succeeding and build their confidence. Have them complete self-assessments of their performance on tests and major assignments, and Andrea is going to get into that a little bit. And then ask students to reflect on what they can do to overcome barriers to their learning. So ask them to empower themselves with those ideas. So how can they improve their study skills? Could they attend a tutoring session? Could they take more practice tests? Could they come to office hours more often? Have them reflect on that and then make an action plan and provide them with the resources to do that. And make failure and tenacity part of the conversation. Talk about your own struggles and failures, things that you have done in your life where you might have failed and had to work hard to overcome something. Sharing that kind of thing in the classroom can make a big difference to your students, because from their perspective, you don't fail, you're already there, right? So I'm going to switch over to Andrea here so she can talk about what she does in the math classroom.
Thanks. Yeah, so I have created 25 different what I call study with purpose lessons that my students create or complete as they're going through the 25 sections that we cover in the course. And these are things that are either behaviors like time management, procrastination, setting goals like we talked about, focus, commitment, those types of things. And then I'll also get into some study skills, ideas like taking notes, anxiety, test taking, and then evidence-based strategies like the forgetting curve, or the fact that there is a productive struggle, right? There's some desirable difficulties that actually lead to learning that students often think, as I mentioned earlier, if they don't get it the first try, then they're not going to get it right, that they need to stick with it and be persistent. And also about mistakes do actually grow your brain. And we talk about the growth mindset, retrieval practice. There's a whole lot of things, and I can send you a list of the things that I talk about. But one thing that I've read in kind of framing how I do things in the classroom is that when you show students evidence that when they know the neurological research about how the brain grows, they actually produce a stronger effort in the classroom. And I find often that students actually don't know this. They haven't been taught these types of things. And so it creates a lot of conversation around those. So it's typically, I give them something to read, and then there's a discussion question that they can either interact with online, or if we're in a webinar or face-to-face in the classroom, we can spend a few moments talking about those types of things. And then one of the things that Katie mentioned was exam wrappers. Honestly, I did not do this for, in fact, a long time. I'm doing this right now for one of my classes, my college algebra class, where students have to, after I do 4 of these discussions, so it counts 4% of their grade, but it is after they take the test, just to take a moment to reflect on what they did. And there's a lot of these exam wrappers out, online. You can look and see one that might fit your methods and what you want to do, but really just thinking about what did you do to prepare for the test? How many days in advance did you start studying? What methods did you use? Looking back at the test, what kinds of mistakes did you make? This is one thing that I've struggled with for a lot, or I see students that once they get a test, especially when I was teaching in the classroom, right, they wouldn't even look at it. And so they really never revisited what things they were doing wrong to be able to correct them moving forward. And so really forcing the student to do that. And then using the growth mindset that they have already talked about, how can you prepare differently for the next test? And then at the end, you can go ahead, Katie, to the next slide, but one of the last ones, we kind of talk about how does this math course actually connect to other classes that you've been taking, like for them to be able to verbalize that this wasn't a pointless class, right? There was some meaning and there is some connection to the other classes, and for them to actually see those connections and kind of going back to those values and interests that the students have.
Okay, so that leads us into the last component, which would be metacognition and self-regulated learning. And this is the idea that we need to help students understand how learning works and how their own strategies for learning could be actually undermining the way that they think that they're learning, but they're actually not. So sometimes it's ineffective study strategies, inability to plan effectively and to manage their time, and things like that. And so once you introduce students to the idea that they need to think about learning, so this metacognitive part of reflecting upon how they learn, and then learning better strategies for doing that. So the cycle of self-regulated learning is the idea that you begin by planning your learning, you set goals, you lay out strategies. And again, we can help, this is where we can help students by encouraging them to set those goals and to think about what strategies they're going to use to learn. Then as they use those strategies, they need to monitor their own performance and then reflect on that performance. So encouraging students to take the time to reflect, just like Andrea said, and then use the results. It's like a data feedback loop, obviously, to guide their performance on the next either test or assessment or whatever the task is. So showing the students these steps and helping them think about their own learning, the idea that reflection is what actually makes learning really concrete. It's that moment where we take learning and make it into deep learning, when we reflect upon what we've learned, can be such a important strategy in the classroom. I have my students reflect a lot in my classrooms, and it's a little easier to work in because I'm an English teacher, and so it can be part of our writing. But as Andrea will talk about, there are definitely ways to work it into the math classroom as well. So here are a few strategies. Planning leads to higher grades. Studies have shown that student planning predicts a higher grade. So when they create a plan on how, when, and where to study for an exam and what strategies and resources to use, that actually translates into better learning and better grades. that also means that they need to then monitor their learning to see how they have used effective strategies or not. So that is exam planning and assignment planning, having them think about at the beginning of the semester how I will earn an A in this course, and then maybe at the end reflect back and think about what strategies were useful and the strategies that they will continue to use. And this might get us back to thinking about how we can work these into learning goals and learning outcomes in terms of the students' reflections. Lecture wrappers, where we ask them questions at the beginning and then at the end to reflect on what they've learned, and metacognitive note-taking, which we'll talk a little bit more about those strategies as well. And then to reflection, to think about what you have learned. So this allows you to practice recall, and it strengthens and consolidates memory. And so, for example, you can analyze what you did and therefore what you learned from the experience. And again, this kind of taps back into the idea that teaching students to fail is the same as teaching them to reflect on, well, in what ways did what I do work? What ways did it not work? What can I do differently next time? How has this failure perhaps taught me something? And therefore it can be considered a success. So reframing it in that way can help us think about the learning process. So Andrea will talk about some more specific strategies here.
Yeah, one of the resources that I used when I was trying to learn all about these types of activities is a book called Make It Stick by Pete Brown. And one thing that I read in that book is that he states that there's no limit to what can be learned if students practice elaboration. And that was really resonated with me, and it changed the way that I have my students interact with the content. One other thing that he said in this text, or this book, is that giving, like the lecture wrapper that Katie just talked about, is that giving a student a 1-question quiz over the lecture is more impactful than actually students rereading their notes or going back and highlighting. So starting that kind of retrieval practice, students being able to pull up that information that they've learned. And again, these are great activities that could be done in the co-requisite course when students kind of have that time apart, because that spaced practice and bringing these things back up is very helpful. But so I created, along with every one of those 25 lessons, is what I call an elaborate and connect. And so it's really just reminding students, right, there is a strategy that's based in evidence-based practices that is effective for learning and helping you retain material. And so telling them that, and then just asking them some leading questions. So you guys that have been teaching math for a long time know that there's some things, key things that you want your students to know after they finish a section. And so giving them time and space to actually write the answers to these questions, and then more importantly, connecting it back to things that they've learned previously. And so by the end of the semester, students have one of these sections that they've completed really for every part of the course that we've taken. And so they can use that really as a way to go back and reflect on what they've learned throughout the course. And so it's been kind of a game changer for my students. They really, at the end of the semester, whenever we talk about things that were very helpful, this is one of the things that they always point back to, along with those study with purpose lessons around the other skills that we just addressed. Yeah, and so if you don't want to do that, the other thing I think that is just important is that you do provide time to reflect on learning. And there's so many tools out there that you can do that. You can have students draw what they do understand on a Google Jamboard or Google Doc, OneNote, like a shared document if you want, or Google Form, or there's Desmos activities that are really cool where you can see what everyone's drawing on the screen. But really just giving them time to think about what's clear in this lesson, what's cloudy. And if they can do that right when they're in the moment, it does lead to longer term learning. And we'll go back to just a sense of belongingness. I had not done this until I participated in the Gateway to Completion project, talking about 2-stage exams. And again, I think in a co-requisite course and the time it's really would be effective there, because I've done this in my own college algebra support class, where you give students the opportunity to take an exam. And it's really in 2 parts. The first part is students take the exam by themselves, and maybe that's 85% of the grade. And then the last 5 to 10 minutes of class, you give students the opportunity to work in groups on the exam. And that result would add like 15% of the grade. And so the benefit of that is that students see that they're maybe not the only ones struggling with the topic, but then they also get immediate feedback on their things that were done incorrectly. And so what I really love is in a co-requisite class, being able to do something like this prior to the actual test in the Gateway course, right? Students get that experience of a true test, and then they get the feedback prior to them taking it in the actual classroom. So it does take time, right? Because you're kind of devoting, if you have 4 tests, 5 tests, whatever it is, you're devoting some of those periods to that, but it is a very beneficial and effective way for students to prepare for exam. And as I mentioned earlier, just that sense of belonging, being able to connect what they're doing to their other courses and their future math classes. And then I would say the curse of knowledge. Remember what it was like, and it's difficult. We as teachers that have been teaching for a long time, it's very difficult for us to remember what it was like to be a novice learner and to not have the information that we have at hand, right? For us, things are so obvious, and it's difficult for us to imagine not knowing it. So really just putting yourself back into that mindset of your students to figure out, what does it look like when I don't know this? What struggles did I have? How can I help equip students to get beyond those? So those are some effective ways you can implement that. Those last 2 things really don't take any time at all.
Okay, so we're coming to close to the end of the session. We wanted to give plenty of time for us to have some conversation at the end. So before we open it up into Q&A and comments, I want you to just take a little bit of time to think about what you've learned during the session and brainstorm for 3 strategies that you might try in your class this fall. We don't have to necessarily tie this to anything formal like a learning goal or an objective, although we can come back to that conversation in a minute. This is more about the strategies you might put in your toolbox that you could perhaps use in your class. And some of you might have been trying some of these things in the pilot. So it'd be also interesting to hear what you're trying and how that is working. So yeah, take 2 minutes to think, and then a few minutes to write, and then share in the chat 3 things you might try in your class this fall. And just to clarify, these can be really sort of very, very specific to your class and your type of students and the material you know you're going to be covering. These can be thinking about the way you might integrate some of these strategies into a very practical, hands-on situation in the classroom. See some things popping up.
there's definitely things coming into the chat.
Yeah,
People are liking the 85-15, which really gets to some of the active learning, which we've talked about throughout these professional development. The goal setting is coming up in multiple posts by people. Appreciate comment from someone looking at goals that are not just easily and readily quantifiable, particularly from a math person to put that. Self-evaluation is coming up as well in discussion boards.
Great. So why don't we turn this into a conversation, because we do have some time. We're at, well, it's 5:30 here. What time is it there? 3:30? So yeah, let's just open this up. And if you put a comment in the chat and you want to just maybe tell us a little bit about what you were thinking and you want to unmute your mic. Eric, oh no, actually it was before Eric, although I'll come back to you, Eric. Trying to see my chat here. I'd love to hear more about the finding ways to measure, seek to measure important. It was Bill, I think, goals that are not readily quantifiable.
Yeah, that's hard to put into a sentence, but I like to think in metaphors. And how do you measure a successful class, a successful student performance? Well, how do you measure a successful marriage? I mean, you can do quantifiable things, but there are things that you just can't get a good measure on that contribute to that. We're in Nevada. We have a gambling state. How do you decide what the odds are? Well, you can do it with quantifiable data, but the odds maker that does it also does it with things that aren't easily measurable, like the attitude of the coach towards the players, the atmosphere in the stadium when there are people that can actually attend a game. There are things that you just can't quantify. And I do know that there is a tendency sometimes to say, well, you got an 89.3, and even if I round it, you didn't get a 90, so you don't get an A. And we hide behind the numbers sometimes. When the last part of my statement, which says, which it is in fact easy to manipulate, I can write a test where nobody gets more than 20%. I can write a test where everybody gets more than 95.
Right.
It's
Bill,
easy.
can I just jump in? You I don't know if you saw my reaction, but you cracked me up when you gave the example of a marriage. But I think that was really a great example, because that's really hard to quantify. It doesn't mean, or it's hard to measure, but that doesn't mean that you therefore can't have a successful or not successful marriage, or things that contribute or detract from that. So I thought it first made me laugh, but the more I thought about it, it was a really nice example.
Yeah, well, I tried to stay away from art. You know, we know what it is. We know what we like. It's very hard to quantify art, but we do this in everyday life all the time. We don't always reduce it to a data point. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm saying we shouldn't always reduce it to a data point. If you're interested in what students know in terms of a skill set, it's very easy to write a test that you can quantify and you can get an answer. But what about what you've been talking about all afternoon? What do students know about connections between two different topics in mathematics? And how do they express that knowledge? They don't express that with a skill answer that photo math or Wolfram Alpha could answer for them. They do it with an attitude.
Right.
Just because we can't measure it doesn't mean it shouldn't be one of our objectives.
And yeah, and I think we can circle back in a minute or two, since we have some extra time, to how we can think about trying to measure some of these things. Interestingly, that you use marriage as an example. Carol Dweck has a whole chapter in her book on mindset on how it connects to relationships and marriage, and how when couples go into a relationship with a fixed mindset, they are less likely to be a successful couple, because they think that the other person can't change and that they can't change. And if you have to work at a relationship, then it must not be successful. So she actually has a whole chapter on using growth mindset, and same for sports. She has a great chapter on sports. It's really interesting on how many athletes are not the people that you would think are, you know, well, he was just born that way. He was a natural talent. So So it's a good analogy to bring marriage to user relationships. Let's have a look at some of the other strategies that people are posting in the chat. Andrea, what do you see that jumps out at you here?
Yeah, I see the Elaborate and Connect come up. Sorry, I'm just having to go back through the 2-step exam. Someone really like that, at least for the co-requisite course, to get that idea of belonging and working together, teamwork. Setting concrete goals at the beginning of the semester and checking in periodically. Yeah, 2-stage exams, and then showing evidence for how our brain grows. I think that's so important. Students really think, again, that it doesn't change, right? That our brain is not malleable, but it is. So letting them know that early on really helps. Self-evaluation after each exam. So these are great. I'm glad that there are strategies that you found that you can implement in the course. And kind of back to that question, Bill, or topic you were just talking about, one of the things I do is like I kind of bring it back at the end of the semester. How I start with that math self-image is I start talking about just asking follow-up questions, like, to taking this class change your image about your math experience? Like, now what is your message to yourself about your math ability? How did this class change it? And so really just getting students to say, yeah, I did grow, right? So even though I can't like quantify what that means, there is at least some type of measure from their experience that shows that there was growth.
Mm-hmm. So I went ahead and stopped sharing so that we can see each other's faces and have more of a chat. So just really at this point, we'd love to hear from you in terms of what you're thinking of trying, things that maybe you've already tried. I see Daniel posted that he's actually done some of these in his pilot. How did it work in your pilot, Daniel?
It seems to be working well. My strategy for keeping the students thinking of them after those first 2 weeks hasn't been very successful. I've been trying to do little projects to remind them, like telling them to show me some notes they've taken or post a discussion about the strategies they used to study for a test or something like that. But it's a little hard to get participation with that. And so that's something I'm looking forward to, is trying to keep that throughout the semester as we go. But I have had students later in the semester refer back to me and they're like, I remembered you said that we should try flashcards to study for a test that had a lot of vocabulary. So for this geometry test, I did that and I got an A finally. I'm like, good job, you know? So it's there. It's definitely something happening. I'm not sure if it's 100% successful yet, though.
Anybody else want to share things that they might want to try, or just sort of comments and feedback on ideas that have sort of bubbled up while you were listening today, or questions?
While you're thinking about that, I would share, like, I have this book list really that I could share with you, but things that I have found very helpful. I mentioned the one book about Make It Stick by Peter Brown, but also I took the How to Learn MOOC out of University of California at Irvine. That was by Dr. Barbara Oakley, who teaches engineering, but it was really for students to learn how to be successful in like STEM classes. But it was very helpful for me to think about strategies that I can implement in my own classes and in the co-requisite course to help support students. And then she also wrote a book, you may have heard of it, A Mind for Numbers. And so that's been helpful to me. And I've also read the Growth Mindset book by Carol Dweck, Small Teaching, which Katie referenced earlier. So there's a lot of resources out there to just kind of broaden your perspective about what you can do to bring in.
Yeah, one of the principles of small teaching is that we learn best when we have lots of small moments to reflect on what we're learning and have deep engagement with it. And so it fits very nicely with growth mindset and some of these other things, because it encourages us to take moments at the beginning of class or hit pause in the middle, is what James Lang refers to it, or at the end of class, to have those little moments of either reflection or a quick quiz question or a check-in or anything that triggers that sort of metacognitive, what am I learning? How am I learning? Am I stuck? Am I, not using the best strategies? And finding very small, quick moments to build them into the class. One of my favorite parts of talking about small teaching is I give faculty an inventory of like different things that they can do at different times during the class period. And again, this is thinking about face-to-face, but it translates online as well when you think about how you build your modules. But we notice that we all have a tendency to be very good at giving little moments at the beginning, perhaps for reflection or bridging to connections, but we're not so good at remembering to bring things at the end, those wrappers, because we run out of time often, and we haven't, been able to build that time in. And it can help us think a little better about the way we can find those moments to encourage students to draw upon those strategies and to give them that toolbox so they can pull those things out when necessary. Any other questions or comments? It did have the last screen. I'm just going to share it again just because I wanted to show you just very quickly our contact information in case you'd like to reach out with further questions. So those are our emails, and we are happy to follow up if you have questions or if you have a request for some materials that perhaps we mentioned and you would like to have access to, feel free to reach out.
And as you're doing that, I just put a link in the chat. We would love for people to be able to complete an evaluation. And I also put in the chat the entire math professional development co-requisite series. And the reason we do that is we have our final one next week. However, it also shows the past ones. And as you know from today, we are recording these either for your colleagues, or if there's ones in the past that you've missed, please feel free to share these and utilize the NSHE website. I want to give a really big thanks to both Katie and to Andrea for focusing us today. This whole series has gone through lots of different aspects of co-requisite. And, as you were talking about the small teaching opportunities, I think so much about how that fits directly in and how just-in-time teaching and the purpose of a co-requisite support class goes directly in with that. And then how you combine that with some of the pieces that build up that growth mindset, which can be small pieces, as you showed, those self-reflection pieces, but have a purpose that build students' belief in themselves, their self-efficacy. And we also know that that's a key piece to the co-requisite model as well, where it's not show us everything you know before we give you access, or this deficit-based, you're not good enough, but instead this asset-based of tapping into students' potential, helping them to unlock that. And that's our role as educators. And I really appreciate you giving concrete examples. Just so people know, we will be following up also. Renee Davis at NSHE will follow up with the slides as well as the handouts. I know you put the tiny URL, but people will get that again. And if people did not open that up in their browser, it has examples of the specific activities that you did. So some concrete things that you can directly do in your classroom as is, or as instructors and educators like to do, modify to fit for your context. But more than anything, Andrea, Katie, this has been a real pleasure on behalf of everyone in Nevada. I would like to thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you to all the participants within the state. Thank you so much.